Yesterday I did a video about MIM parts, and in that video I compared the usability and the strength of MIM parts to cast parts and forged parts. Well, in the comment section of that video I got a string of questions that I really didn't expect from people, and those questions were, what is MIM parts, and what are cast parts, and what are forged parts? What are the differences between those three things? So I thought I would take a few moments today to go over what are the differences between forged parts, cast parts, and MIM parts, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of all three of those. Now, before I go too far into this video, I want to say there are some basic rules to these categories, and that is forged is usually going to be stronger. That's one of the main rules. But you got to remember, when you compare things like this, you have to compare comparable quality to comparable quality. If you don't do that, well then of course you'll skew that rule. If you compare a top grade cast or MIM part to a poor forged part, well, of course, the poorly forged part is going to be weaker than the other two methods. A perfect example of this would be the Browning High Power. Now, their Mark II guns used a forged frame, but it wasn't the highest quality forged frame in the world. It was a little bit soft, but it was adequate for what their guns did. Now, when they went to the Mark III, they started having 40 caliber guns be a lot more common. And the 40 caliber was warping the forged frames on the Mark IIs, so they had to make a stronger frame. Now they had two options. They could either change their method for forging their frames, and that would be a lot more expensive. They would have to use a better material, better process, etc. It would make their frames be more expensive to produce, but they would be stronger. Or they could go to a high quality casting process that would make a frame that is stronger than the forged ones they were using now, but wouldn't cost nearly as much money to do that. Wouldn't cost nearly as much money to make that switch. Even though the new casting process wouldn't be as strong as a better forged frame, it would still be stronger than the forged frames they were using and would cost less money to implement the new system. So they went with the new casting system, which is more than strong enough to do what they needed to do, even though it's not as strong as it could have been if they'd went to a better forging process. It's still stronger, it's still better, and that's what they did. So just keep in mind as we go on here that when you're comparing these three types of production, you have to compare equal qualities. And with that in mind, let's actually talk about each of the three different production methods. Now, the first one is forging. Forging is basically just taking a block of metal and then applying pressure and sometimes heat to it to shape it to the general shape you need it. It's almost like using modeling clay, but doing it with metal. They just squish it to a shape that they need. Now, when you do this, you're compacting the grain of the metal, you're actually making it stronger, you're warping the grain of the metal, which makes it stronger, so it actually produces a really strong piece of steel. The only problem with the forging process like this is you can't make a precise piece. You just make it to generally the shape you want it, and then you mill the rest of it. You take it to like a CNC machine or something like that, or hand mill it, whatever, and then do the final shaping by hand later, which adds a lot of production cost and a lot of production time. But a lot of people think it is worth it because it produces a really strong, old world style piece of metal that people like. And like I say, it's generally the strongest way you can produce a piece of metal. If you want the strongest you can actually make, the strongest maybe just by a hair, a good forged piece, the best forged piece you can do is going to be pretty much the strongest piece of metal you can make. Now, even though that's generally true, with today's modern casting methods, it's getting to be less true because nowadays they can cast pieces that are just about as strong as forged pieces. Not quite, but just about. A perfect example of this is Ruger firearms. Ruger revolvers are cast. They cast the frames for those guns. So because they're cast, they still have to be a little bit thicker than like a Smith & Wesson that's forged. But just being a tiny bit thicker makes them equally as strong, even though they use a different process that's much cheaper. Now, the big difference between casting and forging is in casting, you actually start with a mold of what you're going to make. A pretty realistic mold of the item. And then instead of shaping the steel, squishing it into the shape you need, you liquefy it and pour it into the mold and let it harden. Now, casting has some really great benefits, but it has some big downfalls too. The best benefit of casting is, like I say, it's cheaper and you can make the final piece a lot closer to the piece you need it to be when you're done. It can be a lot more shaped when it comes out of the mold. You have to do less milling on it later to finish it up. And because the metal is heated up first and then put into the mold, when it sets, the grain sets in that shape. So it makes a good, strong piece. But The downfall to casting is you have a problem with voids. If you get an air bubble or something in there or an impurity in there, well, then you've got an impurity inside the steel. You don't have that with forged pieces since you're never breaking down the metal. So you have to worry about that. If you get an air bubble in a frame and you fire a hot round through it, it could explode. So casting does have the advantages of that you can actually make it closer to what you need it to be right off the bat and have to do less milling on it later. You still have to do some milling on a cast frame usually, but far less than you do on a forged frame. But you have that issue. You have to worry about impurities, voids, etc. in the casting. That's always a problem. And even with the best casting systems, occasionally a piece fails. They have to like x-ray them kind of and see if there's any voids in them. And every now and then a piece will fail. But still, for the most part, most cast frames, especially people like Ruger who do it right, are just about as strong as forged and much cheaper to produce. Oh, and another thing about cast frames is it's easier to make bigger pieces. You can make pieces bigger. When you're forging, you're kind of limited by size and weight. When you're casting something, you're not as limited. That's why you see a lot of big parts, like big parts for trains and stuff and cars that are cast, because it's just easier to do that. It's not practical to forge a part that large, whereas casting can do it with no problem. Now that takes us to the final production method, which is MIM. MIM stands for metal injection molding. That's how they make the piece. They actually inject metal into a mold. But the difference between MIM and casting is the metal is not liquefied. It's not molten metal. What they do is they take a powdered metal and they mix it with a resin or some type of filler material that holds it together. And then they put that powdered material into a mold and shape it into a piece. Now this does have some real advantages over casting because they shape it from a powder, you don't have to worry as much about voids. They fill. They don't really trap air in like a liquid would. So you can actually form a piece that's far less likely to have any voids in it than a cast piece. Now, the biggest advantage to metal injection molding is they can shape the pieces very precisely. They can make them to be almost exactly what they need them to be when they're done. Because they know exactly what the percentage of filler material in that metal powder is, they can estimate how much it's going to shrink. So they put this powdered metal into a mold, which can be a high-grade plastic mold since it's not being heated to a molten state, which is a lot cheaper than having big metal molds. They put the metal in there, they shape it to the precise shape they want it to be, just a little bit larger than what the finished product will be. Then they take it out and they apply heat to it to remove the filler material. When the filler material is removed, the piece shrinks that predetermined amount and they're left with the final piece, which is pretty much exactly what they need it to be. All they have to do to it after that is harden it. And because of this, you see a lot of pieces that are small, intricate little pieces done this way because they can make them perfectly right out of the mold. They don't have to hand do a lot of little pieces, saves them a lot of money. And since it is a powdered process, they know there's not a lot of voids, there's not a lot of problems in it. It's much more reliable than most casting methods. And MIM parts are in use around the world, and a lot of people don't seem to care. A lot of airplane parts are MIM parts. A lot of car parts are MIM parts. People don't seem to worry about that, but then they worry about this little tiny low-stress piece inside their revolver that's MIM. They freak out only because people have told them to freak out, people who don't understand the process whatsoever. And let's keep one thing in mind. When they use a MIM part in a gun, it's probably just as strong as any forged part they were going to use, probably stronger. Because if they were going to forge these tiny little pieces, that requires a lot of work. They're probably not using the best, most expensive forging methods to make those tiny little pieces. Therefore, the MIM piece might actually be stronger than a forged piece. So just because a gun manufacturer tells you we don't use any MIM parts, that's far from saying we only use the best parts. They might be building a weaker gun. They just aren't telling you that. They're just telling you there's no MIM because they know some people are afraid of MIM parts because they don't understand them. So there's your little crash course on the 3 different types of production for metal pieces for firearms and other things in general. Hopefully that helps people kind of have a better understanding, those people out there that didn't understand it already. And now I hope that knowing this, you can stop being afraid of cast pieces or MIM pieces and start worrying about what are the best pieces, not just how they're produced, but how well were they produced. You ain't even my real dad.